We talk a lot about art on this program, but we don't often discuss the buildings that house the art. Architecture is an art all its own. The sketching, conceiving, planning, designing, also the problem solving. Museum structures have evolved through the years to meet the needs of not just the art, but the guests that come to wander through the galleries, enjoy a meal, or attend a festival or a lecture. Today, my guests are a pair of architects who met in the 80s and have been working together professionally and personally ever since. Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi founded Weiss Manfredi, an award-winning multidisciplinary New York City-based design practice that combines landscape, architecture, infrastructure, and art. You may have visited one of their many projects, which include the Seattle Art Museum's Olympic Sculpture Park, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center, and the Tampa Museum of Art renovation and expansion. Their firm has been chosen to design the expansion for the Nelson-Atkins, and we'll find out today how they look at projects differently today than when they began. Welcome to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, where we take you beyond just the art on the walls and into the stories of the artist and the ideas behind them. I'm your host, Kathleen Layton. Thank you so much for being here, Marion and Michael.
Thank you.
I was first introduced to your work when I visited the Olympic Sculpture Park at the Seattle Art Museum. I was blown away by the creativity and forward-thinking nature of that work. Tell us about your thought process with that project and what you hoped to achieve.
You know, it's what's so interesting about thought processes in art is that they're never linear. And for us, I think in many ways, it's about asking the questions that were not asked in the first place. So, for instance, that project was divided, 3 parcels of land divided by train tracks, a highway, a crumbling seawall. It was fully contaminated, and indeed it kept the water in the city apart. So our question was not so much how do you build a park and hire a couple of artists to do 2 bridges, but how could you create a welcoming park where art, community, urban life, and connections could actually shape an entirely new landscape to experience art. So it was really trying to answer another question that led to this 200,000 cubic yard of earth zigzag that crossed all the infrastructure, made it more vivid, but also brought you to the water's edge.
The other thing that I think has been important to our practice, and certainly was foregrounded in that project, is both the social agenda and the ecological agenda were completely interwoven. And what an opportunity to think about how art could start to bring communities together, but also reveal a whole set of ecological issues. So it was an incredible opportunity to not think, as Marion noted, it's a museum, it's a place for landscape, it's a place for people, but to see all 3 of those as synthetic.
You've been at this a long time now. How has the process changed since you started? Michael?
Well, in some ways it's changed quite a bit. Obviously, technology is probably the most evident way in which we practice, ways in which projects are created and built. But in other ways, it hasn't changed. I think we're all still human beings. We still love sunlight. We still appreciate the beauty of art, the beauty of nature. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves, particularly as we've seen projects evolve, seen, I think, situations change, to be reminded of those really fundamental human-centric aspirations that are all part of our kind of collective psyche.
And those don't really change, do they?
Those don't change.
Besides your own work, what museum buildings attract you?
You know, what's so interesting is that, all of us from early childhood, I think, have had opportunities to experience museums in different ways. I'm from California. The DeYoung Museum was where we went on high school, elementary to high school field trips. Over the years, the very same place changed in its personality. The Louisiana Museum, for instance, for us, is perhaps one of the most amazing ones in Europe and Denmark. And then there are others that are hidden and, in a sense, woven into their communities in ways that they're places of discovery, like the Picasso museums. So for us, it's really about a place for a museum, not just being about the artwork itself, but how it's woven into its community and where elements of surprise take you to a new place of perception.
Well, for me, I've had the privilege of growing up in Rome, Italy, where the whole city is a museum. And I think that's made a huge impact on me. I think it's also influenced the work that Marion and I do. You could walk into a piazza, walk up the Spanish Steps to Villa Farnese. You could have an ice cream, look at a beautiful statue. And what I think was remarkable about that, especially now in hindsight, and so influential, is the sense that art and public space were part of life.
You are both endlessly curious in your life as you look at anything, not just architecture or art. I have been struck by that. You have had a relationship with the museum for some time. Do you think that that is something that really helps you with your practice?
Absolutely. I think the sense of curiosity is something that we all have as children. And then over time, as we become adults, sometimes curiosity is not necessarily central to what has been perceived as valuable. For us, though, we love the possibility of learning at the rate of a child every time we begin, and sometimes to come to a place that's familiar, in this case, the Nelson-Atkins Museum, and look at it now with entirely fresh eyes and see something altogether different. From the macro, as it engages a community in the landscape with the Peripheral Shakespeare Festival being set up, for instance, right now, to the detail we just shared with you on our way up to this podcast to point out that the fluting on the backdrop of a particular artwork brought into focus something that was really powerful for us and will become part of our sort of arsenal of inspiration for something in the future here.
I felt like I was in a very magic moment. We were walking up here to record this, and they both stopped, and they both took out their cameras and said, look at this, look at this. Michael, how would you answer that?
Well, I think one of the great, for us, one of the great things about architecture is every project's different. And we never want to get into a position where we're working on a project that's too much like the other one. And the Nelson-Atkins is unique. It's got very special DNA. And that's, I think, what keeps our curiosity sharpened and what keeps us, I think, feeling like we're starting a new adventure. There's a new chapter with each project, and this will be a very long, exciting chapter.
What's the DNA that you're seeing that has attracted you to this project?
Well, there are many, many layers, but I think the most fundamental layer for Marion and myself as architects is the relationship between the beautiful garden and not only the block edition, but the original museum. And that kind of synthetic relationship, architecture and landscape, garden, room, is something that we really want to try to kind of pull out. For us, that's a fundamental DNA here at the Nelson-Atkins that's so remarkable and so unique.
At the very outset, when the original building was built, it was centered. Symmetry was at the height of anybody's understanding of what a museum should be anywhere in the world. And yet symmetries have drifted over time, and certainly the center of gravity with the block edition shifted things east a bit. And what we wanted to do was in some ways bring the foundational DNA into focus in a new way. And so with the West Wing then, framing what Michael's talked about, the landscape, all of a sudden, in some ways, a DNA that had been there has a chance now to have a new registration and impact to actually welcome a community and the landscape and the art together.
It would bring some balance.
Exactly.
You look at calls for proposals all the time. How have you seen that, the ask changing? What are museums looking for now maybe that they weren't looking for 20 years ago?
Well, I think 20 years ago, 40 years ago, even 50 years ago, museums were treasure boxes. They were, I think, thought of as very special places that had a certain sacred quality to them, and you had to be knowledgeable before you could enter a museum. And we found that museums now are embedding themselves in very positive ways in the kind of life of their community, whether through education, celebrations. So the sense of opening the box, both literally and figuratively, is, I think, something that we're seeing in a number of institutions as they are, like many of us, trying to engage larger populations, larger community groups, larger social issues.
Inclusivity.
And I think that just to build on what Michael's saying, and I think your question, they've changed a lot. And yet they have not given up their foundational commitment to creating places where art can be valued and enjoyed by a broader population than just, say, a private home. But what's most important now, though, is that questions of transparency come up, both philosophical and physical. How can people see themselves in the museum? How can they feel welcome? How can they not feel, in a sense, put off by the sense that it is elite or remote? How can it actually be woven into the kind of fabric of the lives of the communities that it's part of? Nelson-Atkins does that so incredibly well. And what we're hoping to do is to build on that, in a sense, philosophical commitment in ways that the architectural expression and performance of it can support that vision.
When you looked at this project for the first time, what were some of the challenges you found that you maybe hadn't expected?
Well, with any museum that has a history like the Nelson-Atkins, it's a building the original building has evolved over time. The block addition is now 20 years old. So there have been a number of changes. Many changes actually in the context of the larger neighborhood have been extraordinarily positive. So that's been a huge change. And I think one of the things that interests us, for example, is how to capitalize on the fact that the neighboring institutions have been growing. There's a trolley line set into place that is going to be transformative. This is what kind of excites us, is those sorts of changes have been really fundamental. And then, of course, so there's an existing building so that there are simple and very real needs, lighting controls, environmental controls that need to be looked at and upgraded.
And just to build on that, Michael was talking about the trolley or the streetcar. That's about connectivity that, in a sense, has been latent but not fully taken care of. And so that's now an addition that's tying a community together in new ways. What we found is that the existing museum has extraordinarily beautiful staircases. Many of them, though, make it difficult for some communities to enjoy the building and feel that they can navigate as easily as they would like to. And in other cases, getting lost in museums is the best gift, but it is very nice to be able to know where you are. And so for us, what we're looking at are strategic ways to make connectivity more inevitable and clear, but also to have the invitation in some cases to introduce transparency, so places of respite to actually look out onto the landscape will be elements now that can be added, because museum fatigue is real. And some of that fatigue comes from having too little access to the natural world. And so being able to have a cadence of connections inside and out, visually and physically, is a gift that is intrinsic here that we're hoping to leverage fully.
One of the great attributes and one of the great strengths of the Nelson-Atkins is its encyclopedic collection. Great Asian art, great art from Europe, great contemporary art. And the famous phrase of, if you don't know your past, you won't know your future, is here for us. I think what the Nelson-Atkins is doing so well in its programming, it's allowing that kind of history of art to become, hopefully, an opportunity for lessons from groups of all ages, from a 5-year-old to a 65-year-old.
The museum has changed so much, even during Julian Zugazagoitia's tenure, which is about 15 years now. Isn't it tricky to look at something that you are going to build that is solid, that will still be as relevant 30 years from now as it is today?
That's such an important question. Both of us, I think, have maybe similar observations, but different ways of maybe articulating this question of being enduring. And to be an enduring treasure really benefits from not being so oversubscribed. We need a room this big today and we need a room that big tomorrow. But recognizing that our very best buildings have evolved over centuries and been able to be used in many, many ways because they are not so overly particularized, so that kind of sense of many chapters being able to be scripted by many different leaders is one of the most important things we can do to make this enduring and beloved.
There's a kind of joke that says that it's easier to renovate a building that's 100 years old than it is a building that's 50 years old. So why is that? I think buildings that were built 100 years, 200 years, have a certain generosity. They have high ceilings, there's natural light, they're made out of materials that endure. So to Marion's point, many buildings in the last 50 years were built with very, very high levels of specificity. And when programs change, when needs change, those rooms, which had been designed so tightly, can no longer function. Whereas in some of the older buildings, there's a certain generosity to how rooms can change over time. And that's, I think, a great lesson for us as we move into this next chapter.
You seem to be in such perfect sync when you're talking about projects. And I know you're probably not always in perfect sync. What do you do when you disagree, or what do you disagree about? Is there something? Yeah, go ahead, Marion.
We disagree about everything. The interesting thing is that we call it the debate phase, which is a healthy term for maybe having different points of view. And every now and again, if we really can't solve a debate, and this is particularly when it comes to design, whoever feels most passionately about that that particular debate can win, sort of. And so, one thing that's a gift for us is that we live in Brooklyn and our office is in Tribeca, Manhattan. We walk every morning across the Brooklyn Bridge, which means we're on a wooden boardwalk for most of our way to the office over a river. And with the kind of shared horizon ahead, we usually try to resolve our debates before the staff gets to hear our consensus.
One of the and sometimes we need a three-hour walk to resolve things. But that's a great question, and one of the things that I think has allowed us to make the most out of two different voices is that we both draw, and often we'll discuss, we'll debate. But then Marion may put pencil to paper, I'll draw over it, or I'll start a sketch. And then pretty soon it's pretty evident, oh, that's what you meant. Well, that's not so different from what I thought. And I think the gift of drawing together, like two musicians playing, allows us, I think, to take away the highly personal, I've got to stand.
This is my idea. This is what we should do.
Pretty soon it becomes the idea. It becomes like a child. The child has its own personality that we hope we can nurture into a beautiful project.
Ever a moment when you just really did not agree and you each thought you were right and you had to walk away and maybe have a third party take a look at this?
Well, we've certainly done the walk away moment. Every now and again, there's a walk out of the office and around the block to do a reset. And when we have a major debate, what we find is that we need to come up with new solutions, usually plural. And then if they're plural, what we do is we ask some of our trusted team members in the office, especially the ones who aren't nice and don't care what we think, and we pin everything up and we say we have no favorites, but we really want some feedback. And then usually from that, if we have 4 up on the wall, a 5th one emerges from the conversation. So that's sort of a good way out, is to say there's more choices ahead.
Mm-hmm. I think once you put drawings up on a wall, whether they're digital or analog, once you make models, all of a sudden, the conversation is less personal. It's about what you're looking at and what you're critiquing. And then, as Marion said, bringing in some of our trusted colleagues, it becomes a larger conversation. It doesn't mean it's my idea or Marion's idea. It's the ideas that are up on a wall. And we found that that's absolutely essential for 2 reasons. One is it depersonalizes the conversation, but it also allows some other voices to kind of, in a way, enter into a project.
There are so many layers to what you do, just in an architectural project, but there's also in your lives teaching. There's also a lot of other things. What is it that gives you the most satisfaction?
It's all of it, all at once, right? I mean, that's really, we both teach. We've been teaching. We used to support ourselves by teaching only and only paid our staff. But I think 6 years into our practice, we could pay ourselves too. But we also write. And so our most recent book, Drifting Symmetries, which I know you have in your big bookstore, is a way for us to both take the research that we're doing with our graduate students, but also unpack it, because these are sources of inspiration. In some cases, historic projects from 500 years ago, say the Kaju Bridge in Isfahan, inspires us as much as contemporary projects. And if we can share our work and share our research and those resources together, that really, those threads together, we gather energy from our staff, from our students, from what we see around, and in a sense, writing is a way of trying to give it measure.
Yeah, just as I think there's the teaching, the writing, and of course, sometimes we do drawings just to do drawings, just to kind of create a kind of a beautiful artifact that becomes part of the conversation. That too gives us pleasure. I think It's the idea of sometimes the craziness of the simultaneity can be too much, but I think it enriches our work. And then there's that moment when a building opens and it's no longer yours, but it belongs to the world. And that, I think, both Mary and I get extraordinary joy out of that. It's no longer our little project or our office's little project. It becomes a citizen of the world.
With the Nelson-Atkins expansion, what are you most excited about?
Everything all at once. Seriously, the most exciting thing for us is that there's so much strength here. This is an extraordinary museum. It sets a very high bar for art, a very high bar for architecture, both with the Historic Museum and the Block Edition. So for us to be asked to be at the very, very top of our game here and now with the mission and vision that the museum has is an extraordinary source of inspiration.
I think for someone to say, oh, the project's finished and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts would be the highest compliment that we could possibly get on this project.
Well, I join our staff and the entire community in looking forward to what this expansion really will feel like once we're walking inside it. Thank you so much for joining us today. You've been listening to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. I'm Kathleen Layton. See you next time.